Hello, YouTube. Tis I, Shaggy. I'm Philaliteo. You can call me Vincent if you like. Please don't call me Vince or Vinny. I began what I decided would be an annual tradition last year in October. People always ask me, "You don't celebrate Halloween?" Oh, I repeat, that is what I said. So, fuck it. Other people do something special for October because October is a fatigue month. October is the time of year in the northern hemisphere when the worst part of the year is about to begin. And the 31st of October falls on a day that just happens to coincide with usually the worst day of the year yet. Halloween, again, not a holiday I celebrate because I'm the kind of person who looks into the antiquity of holidays for what they've been celebrated and how they've been celebrated in the past before I capitulate to celebrating a holiday regularly. I will celebrate it in the specific manner in which a group of people has invited me to celebrate with them, but as I have only ever been invited to maybe 5 Halloween parties ever, I have never celebrated Halloween. I'm going to read for you a personal favorite. We're going to return to John Keel. Last year, I read and nearly destroyed John Keel's The Mothman Prophecies. And this year, for Spoopyween, I'm going to read for you John Keel's Disneyland of the Gods. Interestingly enough, this book, the company that owns the rights to publish this book, is in Point Pleasant, Virginia, birthplace or home of the Mothman. And the book, The Mothman Prophecies, was written by John Keel. But even more interesting, this book itself was printed, made in the United States, Cleveland, Ohio, 26 September 2025. This book was printed for me for like 4 days ago. The future is awesome. The future is awesome. So if you're there, if you're actually out there as I read each chapter, we can stop and do commentary until I finish. But no one's going to be out there. So here we go. The man who discovered Frafrotsky's at precisely 9:18 a.m. on the morning of February 19th, a large kitchen sink of gleaming porcelain and shining chrome came crashing out of a cloudless sky into a backyard, the backyard of one Waldo Yentz, destroying his favorite rosebush. In a fit of high pique, Mr. Yentz called the police, the newspapers, the FAA, the U.S. Air Force, and his elderly aunt in Toledo. Great crowds soon gathered in the Yentz backyard to gaze upon the errant plumbing. A learned professor from a nearby college hastily organized a press conference and announced that the sink had obviously fallen from a high-flying jet plane. Yet he did not visit the Yentz yard. He did not visit the Yentz yard, however, pointing out that when you've seen one sink, you've seen them all. The Air Force, on the other hand, told reporters the object must have dropped off a truck passing by on the main highway, which was a mere mile and a half from the Yentz homestead. Mr. Yintz's aunt took the event as an indication that God was mad at somebody. His wife, Shirley, told the curious that she never did like the neighborhood and wasn't at all surprised when the sink made its sudden appearance. Anything could happen in such a rotten neighborhood. Unbeknownst to the befuddled Yenses, kitchen sinks were bombarding a Moscow suburb that week, and Pravda denounced them as part of a new imperialist plot. In London Hyde Park, a pigeon fancier was brained by a piece of aerial plumbing on the same day that the Yentz rosebush was flattened. On the other side of the world, in New Guinea, the natives were made restless by a massive urinal that tumbled down from the heavens. They immediately built a shrine around it and began worshipping it. News of the crashing sinks traveled slowly, for the major news media were preoccupied, as always, with the ambiguous statements of politicians, rumors of wars, and cover-ups within the cover-ups. But slowly, reports of plumbing were collected by the some 1,500 people scattered around the world who make it their business to keep track of such things. In time, they would issue a massive final report on the matter, accusing the governments of the world of withholding the facts about falling sinks from the public and demanding that the United Nations organize a team of scientists to look into the matter. They would be ignored, of course. They're used to being ignored. It's proof that a massive conspiracy exists to suppress the truth. These people call themselves Forteans. They hate each other with a fierce passion and are completely suspicious of everyone else. When the first Fortean Society was founded in 1932, the man after whom it was named, Charles Fort, flatly refused to join, grumbling that he would sooner join the Elks. The society journal Doubt was published at random intervals, usually one issue every 2 or 3 years, and its editorial position was that it was against everything and everybody. Those matters which were not direct governmental conspiracies were obviously plots contrived by the military and scientific establishments. Latter-day Forteans envision a massive military religious industrial complex which runs the world and is deliberately leading us all to ruination and damnation. Since each Fortean has a theory to explain the bizarre things he is investigating, and since each theory contradicts all other theories, the world of Forteana is a bedlam of battered egos and misplaced sentiments. The Forteans not only expect to be ignored, they demand it. Procession of the Damned, subchapter title. Despite all the nonsense, when we have finally scrambled or crawled our way through the unfortunate 20th century, we may look back and realize with a terrible shock that Charles Hoy Fort towers above Winston Churchill, Albert Einstein, Tom Edison, and all the other alleged giants of these 100 years, that ate saints and farted Hitlers. Fort squeezed the udders of the sacred cow of science, and he made us recognize that we were living in an age of miracles, an age when kitchen sinks could fall from the skies while little green men from somewhere else cavorted in our city parks. He opened our eyes to things that had been there all along. He cataloged oofs, out of place things, and Fafrotskis, things that fall from the skies. It was Charles Fort's misfortune to live in an age when writers were cheated and conned, ignored and abused, and expected to starve. A period not unlike the 1980s. At the age of 18, he became the editor of The Independent, a newspaper published in Queens, New York, which died after a few issues. In 1893, at the age of 19, he set out to hitchhike around the world. Already, he was an imposing young man, nearly 6 feet tall, somewhat overweight. He was portly all his life, with a fashionable mustache and a pair of thick lensed glasses perched on his nose. His grandfather, John Hoy, financed his adventures by supplying him with the lordly sum of $25 per month, more than enough to survive in those days. In the grand tradition of all young adventurers, he slept under the stars beside the railroad tracks, went hungry, and dreamed of the glorious days ahead when his travels would inspire immortal short stories and novels. Instead, he contracted a fever in South Africa. A mysterious malady, probably malaria, that would hound him for the rest of his days. He returned a shuddering wreck to New York City, where an English girl, Anna Filing, nursed him back to health. They were married on October 26, 1896. They did not live happily ever after. Obsessed with the business of writing, Charles Fort was doomed to spend many years on the periphery of society, barely able to make the rent for a succession of dingy furnished rooms. He held a number of temporary jobs as a hotel clerk, watchman, dishwasher. Sometimes during the cold winters, they burned the furniture to keep warm. By the time he was 30, he had written 10 novels. Only one, The Outcast Manufacturers, was ever published. It laid a large egg. However, Fort's sense of humor enabled him to write saleable short stories. Theodore Dreiser, a young editor at Smith's Magazine in 1905, later recalled, "Fort came to me with the best humorous short stories that I have ever seen produced in America. I purchased some of them." And other editors did the same. And among ourselves, Richard Duffy of Tom Watson's, Charles Agnew MacLean of the Popular Magazine, and others, we love to talk of Fort and his future, and a new and rare literary star. End quote. Despite the growing demand for his stories, Fort found it difficult to keep bread on the table. "Have not been paid for one story since May," he wrote in his diary in December 1907. "Have $2 left. Watson's has cheated me out of $155. Dreiser has sent back 2 stories he told me he would buy. One even advertised to appear in his next number. Everything is pawned. I am unable to write. I can do nothing else for a living. My mind is filled with pictures of myself cutting my throat or leaping out the window head first." End quote. In his early diaries, notes, and letters, now preserved at the New York Public Library, Fort complained of frequent spells of depression and dark suicidal moods. These would be followed by frenzied fits of writing, when he would churn out novels and short stories by the pound. He had a manic, depressive type personality, and it's possible that his malaria-like malady was a mysterious physical ailment typical of those which plague such personalities. Around the age of 32, he began to spend more time in the New York Public Library. While browsing through some old scientific journals, he came across some odd, unexplained items, and he discovered that the journals, newspapers, and magazines of the 19th century were crammed with such items. Strange objects seen in the sky, weird creatures and machines rising out of the world's oceans, peculiar foreign objects falling from the sky, everything ranging from great quantities of raw meat and blood to hand-carved stone pillars. People and things were often disappearing suddenly, only to reappear halfway around the world. Human footprints and man-made objects were repeatedly turning up in coal mines and geological strata dating back millions of years. Fort recorded these reports on scraps of brown paper, writing his notes in his own special code. Day by day, month by month, year by year, the notes accumulated until he had thousands of them. In 1915, at the age of 41, he started to organize these notes into a book he planned to call X and Y. He never finished it, discarding it for another idea, a book that eventually appeared as The Book of the Damned. In May 1916, his uncle, Frank Fort, died, leaving him a small inheritance, sufficient to support him and Anna for the rest of their lives. The long struggle was over. The Forts moved to a small apartment in the Bronx. When The Book of the Damned was completed, wary editors read the opening lines and held their noses. A procession of the damned. By the damned, I mean the excluded. We shall have a procession of data that science has excluded. Battalions of the accursed, captained by pallid data that I have exhumed, will march. You'll read them, or they'll march. Some of them livid and some of them fiery and some of them rotten. By this time, Theodore Dreiser had become one of America's most famous and most influential novelists. He was also Fort's leading advocate. He took the manuscript of The Book of the Damned to his own publisher, Horace Liveright, probably, and dumped it on his desk. Liveright reluctantly read it and then complained, "I can't publish this, it'll lose money. Whoops. Dreiser told him flatly, "If you don't publish it, you'll lose me." The literary world greeted the Book of the Damned with awed enthusiasm. Newspaper and journal reviewers heaped praise upon the strange opus. Men like Booth Tarkington, John Cowper Powys, Ben Hecht, and Tiffany Thayer, all big names in their time, applauded. I am the first disciple of Charles Fort, Ben Hecht wrote in the Chicago Daily News. He has made a terrible onslaught upon the accumulated lunacy of 50 centuries. Whatever the purpose of Charles Fort, he has delighted me beyond all men who have written books in this world. Fort's reaction to the publication of his first book since his ill-fated novel a decade earlier was to sink into a deep depression. He gathered up his notes and estimated 40,000 of them and burned them all. Then he and Anna packed their bags and sailed for England. Fort believed that his book was a flop. Sales were very sluggish, and that he had wasted his life. He was 46 years old. The Forts lived in London for 8 years. We don't know how Anna spent her days while her husband went off to the British Museum to pore over old books and crumbling magazines. In the evenings, he often joined the loafers at the Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park to amuse himself in debates. He wrote his second book, New Lands, in London. It dealt chiefly with skyquakes, the thunderous explosions that have emanated from the sky for hundreds of years, and in many parts of the world. In recent years, these skyquakes have occurred every January through February in the northeastern United States. The authorities have repeatedly assured reporters that they are caused by jet planes, especially the Concorde supersonic job. They neglect to mention the long history of the phenomenon. Skyquakes. Oh, my friend Lucas is in here. Hey, no, let's go not in here, friend. That was creepy. Anyway. Skyquakes were this long before jets or even airplanes had been invented. Fort envisioned, tongue-in-cheek, a land in the sky that served as home base for all the debris that keeps falling on us. Huge blocks of ice, for example, have been crashing through rooftops for hundreds of years, occasionally killing people and livestock. Today, when a 50-pound hunk of ice hurtles into someone's living room, our learned authorities announce that it fell from a passing airplane. They even have the audacity to claim that it is refuse from the plane's bathroom. Of course, any pilot will tell you there is no way for the bathrooms to discharge water while in flight, but our explainers never bother. He's just going to chill out right there in that pocket and listen to me read. It's going to freak me out. Never bother to check such details. Fort chuckled a bit about these ice falls and suggested there might be great aerial ice fields up there. A silly notion, yet a few years ago NASA suggested the same thing. Somewhere, hundreds of miles overhead, there might be new lands of ice. Critics of Fort, most of whom are members of the scientific establishment who have never even read his books, complained that his main sources were newspapers. This is not so. He carefully cited all his sources in his books, and they are mostly scientific journals, particularly journals of astronomy. Fort took great pleasure in pointing out the stupidity of astronomers, usually damning them with their own words. Quote, I don't know what the mind of an astronomer looks like, but I think of a fizzle. Oh, there he goes. Oh, that freaks me out. Seeing movement on the other side of that blanket freaks me out. But he just left. Or, no, he's going the other way. Okay. I don't know what the mind of an astronomer looks like, but I think of a fizzle with excuses revolving around it, he wrote in New Lands. Each new generation of astronomers discards all the theories of the previous generation and creates some whoppers of its own. Come on, pal, go on. Stop. It's weird. I don't like it. You're freaking me out. Lucas, come on, man. Each new generation of astronomers discards all the theories of the previous generation and creates some whoppers of its own. Our space probes have disproved many of the most cherished myths of modern astronomy. Too bad Fort wasn't around to view the intellectual acrobatics of the 1960s. Astronomers were proven wrong about many of the basics of our solar system, e.g., the temperature of Venus, the age of the moon, the rotation of Mercury, the topography of Mars. Until 1960, all leading astronomers flatly denied the possibility of extraterrestrial life. Then NASA began flashing big bucks, tax dollars, for investigation into life on other worlds. Astronomers jumped on the bandwagon. Suddenly, we were being told that there must be billions of inhabited planets out there. Some scientists created exobiology, the study of extraterrestrial life. Since we have no samples of such life, and since all of our efforts with radio telescopes, etc., have failed to find evidence of even a single planet outside our solar system, it is okay, but that was in the 1980s. It is mighty difficult to investigate such life. We poured many millions of dollars down that exobiology rat hole. Now that the gravy train has ended, the astronomers are quietly retreating to their pre-1960 position. The biggest astronomical scam of the 1970s was the black hole. It began as a minor element in a science fiction story published about 30 years ago. Basically, it's the notion that a dying star shrinks to a very heavy mass, so heavy that light can't escape from it. Therefore, it is invisible and we have no way of detecting its presence. Science writer Fred Warshawski put it this way: the physicist outside the black hole cannot get any information from inside it and has no way to understand the laws which govern it. Without that understanding, he need not seek the laws, since they are impossible to understand. End quote. That's an extremely Buddhist way to think about it. The black hole is a foolproof theory. And people like Neil deGrasse Tyson will happily talk about other people's theorizing that we exist in another black hole. Because anything can happen in the impossible. The black hole is a foolproof theory because there is no way of testing it, of proving or disproving it. Perfect fodder for the Walt Disney Studios. Cranks and crackpots. Fort was not against the astronomers. He was amused by them. But the other sciences are just as amusing. Archaeologists have been busy burying more things than they dig up, ignoring everything that doesn't fit into their theories. For example, they tell us that North America was uninhabited by anyone except Indians before the Europeans arrived. They overlook all the stone towers and structures found all over the continent, including miles of paved roads, when the Pilgrims arrived. Fort cataloged all kinds of metal objects, from swords and axes to coins that had been found and dated as pre-Columbian. Somebody was mining ore and coal in this country and pumping oil in Pennsylvania before Columbus set sail. Rather than tussle with the problem of identifying those mysterious North Americans, the archaeologists have chosen to ignore these artifacts. Largely, this remains true. It's no longer ignorable that there were Vikings, Scandinavians, in North America before Columbus. But in 1980, that was not common or consensus agreement in archaeology. It is now, but it was not then. Intellectual cowardice is only one of the problems of the academic community. Fort rubbed their noses in the swill generated by their gibberish and illiteracy. It was no secret then or now that academic publications are designed to protect the inept and to conceal ignorance. People with nothing to say, who even lack the ability to say nothing, can hide behind the academic method for a lifetime. Quote, "I shall be scientific about it," Fort noted. Said Sir Isaac Newton, or virtually said he, "if there is no change in the direction of a moving body, the direction of a moving body is not changed. But," continued he, "if something be changed, it is changed as much as it is changed. How do geologists determine the age of rocks? By the fossils in them. And how do they determine the age of the fossils? By the rocks therein. Having started with the logic of Euclid, I go on with the wisdom of a Newton. End quote. Continue quotation. Consider anything of a sociologic nature that ever was grown, he wrote. That there never has been an art, science, religion, invention that was not at first out of accord with established environment, visionary, preposterous, in the light of later standards, useless in its incipiency, and resisted by established forces, so that seemingly animating it and protectively underlying it, there may have been something that, in spite of its unfitness, made it survive for future usefulness. Also, there are data for the acceptance that all things in wider being are held back as well as protected and prepared for, and not permitted to develop before comes scheduled time. One of the greatest secrets that has eventually been found out was for ages blabbed by all the pots and kettles of the world. But the secret of the steam engine could not, to the lowliest of intellects or to suppositiously highest of intellects, more than Adam Bradively reveal itself until came the time for its coordination with the other phenomena and requirements of the industrial age. End quote. Thus, in this way, Fort redefined what theologians call predestination. He knew that the present does not control the future, but rather that the future somehow controls the past. If Adolf Hitler had been born in, say, Bolivia, 20 million corpses could still be alive. But the future needed Hitler because it needed the atom bomb and the accompanying hardware capable of destroying the planet. We would not have developed the doomsday machine if we hadn't launched a crash program as part of our effort to crush Hitler. We not only failed to save 20 million victims, we built the gallows for the entire human race. Unable to read the future, we are all Napoleons marching confidently to Waterloo. Fort and his wife returned to New York in 1929 just in time to witness the Wall Street crash. Luckily, Fort had safely invested his meager inheritance and managed to stay afloat. They moved back to the Bronx, and he worked on his next book, titled Lo, another assault on astronomers. It lists many strange reports of unidentified aerial objects. Sitting in his study, Fort pecked out two simple sentences which would identify the flying saucer mystery, define it, and touch upon the only possible explanations. End quote. Unknown luminous things, or beings, he observed, have been seen, sometimes close to this earth and sometimes high in the sky. It may be that some of them were living things that occasionally come from somewhere else in our existence, but that others were lights on the vessels of explorers or voyagers from somewhere else. End quote. For the first 33 years of the modern UFO epoch, 1947 to 1970, the notion that those mysterious lights and objects belonged to, quote, the vessels of explorers or voyagers from somewhere else, end quote, was the most popular theory. A handful of cranks and wishful thinkers spread propaganda that extraterrestrial visitants were flocking to this mudball. But the great UFO wave of 1964-68 attracted a new generation of investigators and scientists. They soon realized that the extraterrestrial hypothesis was untenable for many reasons, so they fell back on the explanation that the objects came, quote, from somewhere else in our existence, quote. That somewhere else could be as elusive as the fabled fourth dimension or the other planes of psychic lore. Fort himself had realized early in the game that the events he was studying were not unusual. They happened year after year, century after century. More importantly, they tended to occur in the same geographical locations. This strongly indicates that these events, be they fish falling from the sky or strange aircraft adorned with flashing lights, are inexorably linked with the Earth. They are as much a part of our environment as clouds and bumblebees. Another important factor is that all of the events described by Fort are interrelated in some mysterious fashion. Science fiction writer Damon Knight extracted some 1,200 events from Fort's books and fed them into a computer at the Bell Laboratories in New Jersey. Some very interesting patterns were revealed. Quote, one salient fact about UFOs is missing from all modern accounts I have seen, Knight commented. Fort's data show that they are not isolated phenomena. Unknown flying objects, unknown bodies seen in space, appearances and disappearance, poltergeist activity, falls of strange substances and organisms from the sky. All these things show strong positive correlations with each other. Taken together, they show evidence of rhythmic fluctuation. End quote. Strange coincidences. Incredible though it may seem, sightings of sea serpents tend to occur simultaneously with sightings of unidentified flying objects. Showers of frogs and worms in kitchen sinks. Actually, no kitchen sinks have ever been reported. The anecdote at the beginning of this chapter was just a sly example. And mysterious disappearances. As for the latter, they are most often grouped in the month of July, which is also a big UFO month. A man goes out to mow his lawn and is never seen again. One second, actually. I need to plug this headphone in because if it dies, I'm gonna be really annoyed. I need this headphone to be not dead. Actually, I need this headphone to be charging. Sorry. If it gets, I'll just be annoyed. We'll cope. As for the latter, they're most often grouped in the month of July, which is also a big UFO month. A man goes out to mow his lawn and is never seen again. Some 3,000 people disappear annually in the U.S. That is, 3,000 people vanish with no apparent motivation, no hint of what happened to them or how. Naturally, many hundreds of thousands of others disappear, fleeing the law, relatives, or creditors. When a UFO wave develops, usually about once every 5 years, we can be sure that sightings at Loch Ness will increase sharply, that showers of stones, always warm to the touch, will start pelting isolated homes in suburbia, and that people will start to disappear everywhere. These manifestations are accompanied by magnetic storms and sharp, dramatic deviations in the Earth's magnetism in certain locales, particularly in areas such as the famous Bermuda Triangle. In the 1950s, a Canadian named Wilbur Smith devised a special instrument to detect and measure the collapse of molecular structures during magnetic storms. All kinds of objects literally fall apart when magnetic conditions are just right. Volunteer airline pilots carried Smith's instruments around the world, and he was able to make crude charts of the phenomena. Unfortunately, no one continued his experiments after his death. Charles Fort perceived a truth that had been ignored by scientists and historians. Our world has two sets of natural laws. One set tells us stupidly simple things about gravity and nature. The other tells us that space and time are constantly distorted in our reality, and that we are all subject to the still undefined laws of that second set. We never know when we might step through that magic door that will suddenly transport us 10,000 miles away. We never know when we might encounter a beast or a being from somewhere else in our existence. Fish may rain on us, or red snow, or clouds of insects that no scientist can identify. Flying saucers will continue to buzz our farms and swamps just as they have for thousands of years. Science attempts to work with the first set of laws, and they come up with black holes. Magicians, occultists, and psychics strive to manipulate the second group of laws. In the closing years of this century, science and magic are merging. When Fort studied the bizarre events of the superspectrum, a spectrum of energy beyond the known and the visible, he was obliged to ask, if there is a universal mind, must it be sane? End chapter. I like to have commentary here, I'm going to take something to drink, have a little bit of a smoky smoke, and then we will continue. But that end quotation of chapter the first, that right there, stick that in your Halloween pipe and smoke it. If there be an infinite, omniscient, omnipotent consciousness, must it be sane? Must it? Must pack that in your bowls and smoke it. That is a question that demands answering, in my opinion. Must it? Why? Sane is only relative to another thing of your class. Sane relative to what? Which two humans? Which two humans in any dyad of people? Any pair of people is wholly sane. If you've ever been married, which of the two of you was fully sane? And if we're made, fashioned, created, made in that thing's image, which one of us is sane? So why must it be sane? What must is a strong word. I don't have any takers on conversation about the piece. So you're not gonna bite. I'm just gonna go back to that was a good hit. Go back to reading. Speak now or forever hold your peace, homie. I'm not gonna super duper want to talk about this outside of the chat. Probably not really much at all tomorrow. Really gonna want to talk about this come tomorrow, guys. That's probably not true. I'll probably be talking about it a bunch tomorrow. John Keel is my favorite thing. He's my favorite author. I see so much of his style in my own voice. I see so much of my style in his voice. We share. I've aped him a lot, borrowed a lot from the way he writes. I've read a lot of his work, and by a lot of his work, I mean he's one of very few authors that I have pleasure read. This is a pleasure read for me. All right, we move on to chapter the next. A short history of boobery. A gentleman named Lester J. Hendershot surfaced in 1928, offering the world a wonderful miracle motor he had perfected. It derived its energy from the Earth's magnetic field, he claimed. He happily demonstrated it for many. A Major Thomas Lanphier of the U.S. Army became one of his biggest boosters and even stated that he had helped assemble one of the motors, and there was nothing fraudulent about it. It weighed less than 10 pounds, fewer, he means. It ran sewing machines, lit electric lights, and powered meat grinders, all without being hooked up to any outside wiring or fuel tanks. Inventors have been trying to peddle wondrous perpetual motion machines and magical motors since the beginning of time. There is, however, a fascinating sidebar to the Hendershot story. He managed to develop an arch enemy, a sinister Dr. Frederick Hochstetter, also of Pittsburgh, followed Hendershot around, holding press conferences, attacking him and his motor. According to Hochstetter, the Hendershot motor ran on flashlight batteries and would destroy faith in science for 1,000 years. His only motive for exposing this shameless hoax, he explained, was to assure that, quote, pure science might shine forth untarnished, end quote. Charles Fort followed the careers of that duo with great interest. The newspapers chronicled the appearances of Hendershot and quoted Dr. Hochstetter's angry assaults at great length. Then, while visiting a patent attorney in Washington, D.C., Hendershot was showing off his little motor when he suddenly received a shock from a bolt estimated at 2,000 volts, which paralyzed him and sent him off to an emergency hospital. That was the last anyone heard of Lester Hendershot, and it also seems to have ended Dr. Hochstetter's career as a defender of the scientific faith. But there were many, many scholarly gentlemen who would follow in his footsteps across the decades. However, a new Hendershot appears on the scene. A dozen Hochstetters, eager to share his limelight, rise to protect the gullible public. You may recall the sudden appearance of Uri Geller in the 1970s. Geller had a magic show in Israel. He was a personable young man, handsome and charismatic. One day he discovered that he had what Fort would have called a wild talent. Spoons and keys and heavy metal bars seemed to bend mysteriously in his presence. Geller, discovered by Dr. Andrea Puharich, I don't think that's right, a world-renowned parapsychologist, world-renowned, not renounced, renowned. I don't know how you could be a world-renowned parapsychologist, but the 1970s were a different time, was soon appearing on TV screens around the world. People sitting in his audiences would discover that the keys in their pockets and purses had bent by themselves. Geller became very famous. Early on, Geller's personal Hochstetter began to dog his steps. His name was James Randi, a diminutive fellow magician with a motorized mouth. Randi decided to crusade against the new science-busting art of metal bending. He followed Geller around the country, denouncing him as a fraud and spoon bending as a mere stunt. When Geller appeared on the stage of the Johnny Carson show, Randi lurked in the shadows backstage, trying to catch him in some act of trickery. Like the other Hochstetters of this world, Randi became entwined in a foggy belief system of his own. By his reasoning, everything that seems impossible must be the product of deception, lying, and pure skullduggery. Spoons do not bend by themselves, so therefore Uri Geller must be bending them somehow. The truth is that this odd talent is not confined to Geller. Millions of people discovered they could bend spoons just as easily, that when they concentrated on the metal, it would become as soft as putty and could even be tied in knots. Spoon-bending parties became the rage. A CIA-sponsored study at a major university began examining spoon benders and conducting complex tests with the bent metal. Dr. Puharich even established a home for gifted children who were able to perform the feat. Did all this give Randi pause? Certainly not. To his credit, Geller has simply ignored the little man who affects a flowing cape and a graying beard. He toured the world. He was especially popular in Japan, getting richer and richer while Randi pursued him impotently, getting angrier and angrier. Randi eventually wrote a book, The Magic of Uri Geller, an expose based in large part on the testimony of Geller's former chauffeur. In 1987, Geller was invited to Washington to confer with the president and members of the cabinet on ways to bring about world peace. The Secret Service noted that there was an odd person in a cape lurking outside the White House gates. The Hochstetter Syndrome. When the first flying saucer craze erupted in June 1947, scores of enthusiastic advocates emerged. Some of them had been collecting reports of odd aerial things for years, and they had ready-made conclusions. The leader of the pack was Raymond Palmer, editor of Amazing Stories and founder of Fate magazine. There was Mr. Meade Lane and his spiritualists, who had been talking to the saucer people for years. Tiffany Thayer and his hearty band of Forteans saw great governmental conspiracies behind the phenomena. However, the skeptics far outnumbered the believers in those days. Most newspapers treated the incoming UFO reports with levity, Comedians, columnists, and radio commentators created a whole new category of saucer humor. Anyone with any scientific credentials sneered and guffawed. Flying saucers were impossible, they snorted in unison. Such things could not be. It was all just a silly fad. But the damnable things did not go away. Since they were buzzing around our military and atomic installations and landing on highways and in farm fields with impunity, the United States Air Force was terribly embarrassed. If UFOs were real, they were making fools of our military, proving that our expensive Air Force was incapable of defending the skies over the United States. The government's solution to this dilemma was simply to deny the existence of the objects. To this end, they set up a phony public relations office known as Project Blue Book, and they enlisted the aid of a prominent Harvard astronomer, Donald Menzel. Dr. Menzel had been involved in various classified government projects and wrote science fiction as a hobby. It is possible that the government paid him to become an anti-UFO spokesman, but perhaps he was just another victim of the Hochstetter syndrome and became anti-UFO because of some deep psychological need. The same kind of need that drove Randy to hound Uri Geller. Dr. Menzel became ufology's earliest critic. He wrote reasonably well, and his byline appeared in many popular magazines. He had a simple, scientific explanation for all UFO sightings. They were caused by air inversions. This is a meteorological condition created when pockets of cold air get trapped in warm air. The difference in density causes lights from the ground to reflect or refract. Dr. Menzel wrote countless magazine articles and several books on this theme, though he didn't investigate any UFO sightings. If he investigated any sightings, he might have discovered that the air inversions theory wasn't workable. That, of course, would jeopardize his entire belief system. Dr. Menzel spent 20 years attacking UFOs and ufology and antagonizing the hell out of the thin red line of UFO buffs who took his insults personally. They dreamed of making UFOs respectable so that they would become respectable by association. But each tirade from Menzel branded them crackpot psychotics, and they would drool and fume and fill their mimeograph journals with anti-Menzel editorials. Refracted light from air inversions explained the funny glows in the sky, but how did Menzel explain all the car chases, abductions, landings, and weird manifestations? His scientific answer was that all the witnesses were liars, fools, or drunks. That took care of that. In 1966, Dr. Menzel appeared on a TV show with author John Fuller. Fuller had just spent weeks in Exeter, New Hampshire, living among people who were literally under siege from a massive UFO wave taking place at that time. Dr. Menzel quickly denounced all the key witnesses as drunks, even though he hadn't been near Exeter. Fuller put up a brisk, logical, well-documented defense, and millions watched as Dr. Menzel fell apart on national TV. It was like watching Humphrey Bogart play Captain Queeg in the Caine Mutiny, clicking a pair of ball bearings and ranting about the missing strawberries. Menzel seemed to fade away after the show and died not long afterwards. The most hated man in the history of ufology was Dr. J. Allen Hynek, minion of the Air Force. Every time he made a public statement, the entire ufological community went into a state of apoplexy. In a silly and extremely costly Air Force boondoggle, Project Grudge, published in 1949, he contributed a list of over 200 reported UFO sightings that he claimed were merely stars, assuming that most people were stupid enough to report stars to the U.S. Air Force. He was teaching at a small college near the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, home of Project Blue Book. What's more, he could be had for a small amount of money. The Air Force needed all the help it could get to keep an irate UFO-watching public off its back. They were looking for someone with academic credentials who could lend authority to their wild anti-UFO statements. Somebody who would just take the money and run. Swamp gas. For 18 years, the U.S. Air Force paid Dr. Hynek an average of $5,000 per year as a consultant. But, by his own admission, he was never consulted about anything. When official committees were formed to review the UFO problem, the Air Force called in Dr. Menzel and a young upstart named Carl Sagan. Hynek's role, according to the director of Project Blue Book, Major Hector Quintanilla, was simple. Twice a year, Project Blue Book sent him a manila envelope filled with sighting reports. His job was to check through the star charts and astronomical catalogs and come up with celestial explanations. Quintanilla complained that he often botched the task by claiming that stars were not even visible and the night in question were mistaken for UFOs. Whenever Hynek's friends and colleagues chided him about his UFO connection, he always explained that he only stuck with it so he could put his child through college. But for 14 years, he maintained a very sincere anti-UFO stand. He was frequently interviewed by the press, and he always gave seemingly plausible reasons for regarding the whole subject as hogwash. During those 14 years, he never investigated a single UFO report personally. When a spectacular UFO event occurred and received heavy press coverage, the Air Force called upon Hynek to explain it away as a weather balloon, flight of birds, meteor, or mass hallucination. Sometimes the Air Force didn't even bother consulting. They just issued a silly statement in his name. If Dr. Menzel raised the bile of the UFO buffs and their organizations, Dr. Hynek drove them into an absolute frenzy. They threw darts at his picture and frothed at the mouth every time he gave the Christian Science Monitor an interview. They assumed he was a big-shot government scientist, probably in the employ of the CIA. To have such a formidable enemy gave them imaginary status. In reality, he was just a humble college teacher, mediocre in his chosen field. On April 24, 1964, a police officer saw an egg-shaped object land outside Socorro, New Mexico, and two small white-clad figures walked around it before it took off again. The officer, Lonnie Zamora, was badly shaken and the case received extensive newspaper coverage. This was the first case that Hynek actually went to investigate. He was convinced there was a natural explanation. In his published Confessions, the UFO Experience, Hynek told how he tried to get the Air Force to conduct a broader investigation, but they just weren't interested. For Dr. Hynek, the Socorro incident was a major turning point. He began to realize, after 14 years of total disbelief, that perhaps there really were some funny, unidentified things buzzing about our skies. 2 years later, in March 1966, an incredible nationwide UFO wave began. Early sightings in Michigan around a girls' school received so much publicity that Major Quintanilla visited the area personally, dragging Dr. Hynek along with him. The Pentagon issued a statement at the time asserting that, quote, more than 100 investigators from Project Blue Book have been dispatched, end quote. The major committed a gross tactical error when, in front of a group of civilians, he ordered Hynek to identify the UFO as marsh gas, with UFOs, plural. Hynek was reportedly flabbergasted and complained that marsh gas was a rare summer phenomenon and certainly would never appear in Michigan in March under any circumstances. Quintanilla was adamant. He reminded Hynek that he was on the Air Force payroll and had better take orders. Most men would have responded, "You can take this job and shove it." But Hynek meekly went back to his motel room and prepared a cautious statement saying that the sightings might have been caused by swamp gas. He read the statement later at a press conference in Detroit, and the reporters guffawed. Swamp gas? The entire country was seeing unidentified flying objects that month. They seemed to be everywhere. Swamp gas, indeed. J. Allen Hynek became the laughingstock of America. Newspaper editorials and cartoons razzed him. Comedians across the country made jokes about the nutty professor and his swamp gas. The Air Forces didn't take the rap. The Air Force didn't take the rap. Hynek did. He was slandered, denounced, and derided all across the county. I'm saying country. County. All across the county. He was called Professor Swamp Gas. Swamp gas became a kind of national battle cry, and the derision continued for months. Anybody else subjected to this kind of public ridicule would have quietly gone on permanent vacation to Alaska. Dr. Hynek seemed almost to enjoy the ridicule and notoriety. He capitalized on it by writing articles for Playboy, Saturday Evening Post, and Popular Photography. Even more astounding, the hardcore UFO buffs who had hated him for years now embraced him as one of their own. For years, now embraced him as one of their own. Overnight, Dr. Hynek became a hero to that sad group who desperately needed a hero. He published a letter in Science magazine declaring, quote, "Where there's smoke, there must be fire." He appeared on so many television shows that he was forced to join AFTRA, the TV union, and was paid scale for each appearance. For the next 20 years, Hynek traveled all over the world, always at someone else's expense, giving empty speeches in which he carefully admitted that he didn't know anything about UFOs and was just as confused as everyone else. At each public appearance, he would make a plaintive plea for funds to launch an expensive computer study of the subject. The money never did materialize. He wrote books based on other people's books and extracts from Air Force files. The title of Steven Spielberg's movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, was taken from a chapter title from Hynek's book, The UFO Experience. Like Lester Hendershot and Uri Geller, Dr. Hynek also had his Hochstetter. The editor of an aerospace trade journal seemed to spend all his spare time poring over Hynek's statements and public pronouncements. Dr. Hynek did have an unfortunate habit of making undocumented claims or getting all his facts scrambled. He seemed to be ignorant of a wide range of subjects, particularly astronomy and psychic phenomena. The editor, a leather-lunged fellow named Philip Klass, gleefully pounced on each of Hynek's errors and issued long, well-written attacks. Klass first surfaced in March 1966 at a UFO press conference staged by Donald Kehoe, a pulp writer. He heckled Kehoe unmercifully and thus became the chief heckler of the rather trivial UFO field. In 1987, he was still attending UFO conventions, causing disruptions and heckling the speakers. Dr. Menzel had his air inversions. Dr. Hynek had swamp gas. Mr. Klass has been promoting the corona effect as the only plausible explanation for UFOs. It is a rare phenomenon that occurs around power lines. Excess current sets up a glow, not unlike swamp gas. This, according to Klass, explains the innumerable UFO sightings reported around power lines. Klass began publishing pieces about the corona effect in the 1960s. He also published his definitive solution to the Socorro landing. It was, he says, a scheme to promote tourism. The local Dairy Queen started selling saucer burgers after Zamora's sighting. Zamora left the police force to enjoy the fruits of his involvement in the scheme by getting a job in the local gas station pumping gas. A meteorologist named James McDonald plunged into the UFO fray in the 1960s, and when Klass was not pursuing Hynek's statements, he was scrutinizing Dr. McDonald's learned papers under a magnifying glass. McDonald was an expert on lenticular clouds, natural formations that resembled saucers, and was asked to testify at hearings in Washington where controversial plans for a supersonic passenger plane were being discussed. Dr. McDonald felt that the SST, supersonic transport, would be detrimental to the environment. Someone fed the congressional committee info on McDonald's UFO interests, and he was subjected to cruel attacks by the senators representing the aircraft interests by the press. Thrown into a deep depression by the assault on his reputation and fearing that his career was ruined, Dr. MacDonald shot himself in the head. His aim was bad, and he succeeded only in blinding himself. As soon as he was released from the hospital, he somehow acquired another gun. This time his aim improved. Magnificent obsessions. What strange quirks produced the Hochstetters of this world? For 30 years I have blundered around the landscape as an editor, syndicated columnist, radio and TV producer, investigative reporter, and gadfly author. I've written millions of words and have read an average of 5 books a week all my life. This frenetic activity has brought me into contact with hundreds of different belief systems and true believers of every sort. What has this lifetime of study, investigation, experience, and observation taught me? Butterfly collectors, stamp collectors, tattoo artists, jugglers, ventriloquists, and even morticians all have their Hochstetters. It seems to be a rule of human endeavor that for every obsession, there is a counter-obsession. For every Donald Kehoe, there is a Phil Klass. The true believer has an answer for everything within the framework of his belief system. A scholarly friend once told me that you can never argue with a Marxist or a Hindu because their beliefs provide an answer for every question. How comforting it must be to think you know everything. After 40 years in this game, I find that I know less and less. The non-believers operate on the premise that they know more than the true believers, that they know the truth, while the true believer is just a misguided dolt. Political true believers are the most worrisome of all because they act on a theory for manipulation of people and events. There are thousands of political belief systems. None of them is really workable, but belief in their workability keeps them alive and keeps a lot of people in very miserable states. Obsessions with belief systems are worsened when the fragile human ego becomes involved. People with large egos usually have large obsessions. In politics, they become rabid dictators. In religion, they become holier-than-thou types filled with terrible hatreds, which in turn cause guilt complexes that drive them deeper into their religious frame of reference. The outlet for their scrambled emotions is to try to foist their beliefs and their fears onto the rest of us. Somewhere along the line, the Hochstetters of ufology have decided that belief in little green men is dangerous and will drag us all into some new dark age. Actually, ufology is a harmless obsession compared to the others I have mentioned, but the Hochstetters are something to worry about. In recent years, they have been getting organized. Corliss Lamont and an elderly I'm starting to get real bad. Acid reflux. Corliss Lamont is an elderly New Yorker who is rather proud of his title, the millionaire communist. He's loaded and has given a lot of money away to worthy causes and institutions. One of his pet enterprises is the American Humanist Association, AHA, which he rules with benign despotism. The organization has about 2,000 members, publishes a magazine, and adheres to a humanist manifesto, which is a disturbing version of the Communist Manifesto. For years, the AHA was reportedly on the FBI's notorious list of communist fronts. There have been numerous spin-offs, all supported by Mr. Lamont's millions. A great many academic types and college professors, always a naive and gullible bunch, have been sucked into Mr. Lamont's sphere. A few years ago, the AHA set up a group dedicated to Hochstetterism. They declared themselves to be skeptics of almost everything, and they staged frequent press conferences designed to get their names into the newspapers by denouncing social evils like dice throwing, sea serpents, and, gasp, UFOs. Some of the professors decided they would expose the ancient science of astrology once and for all. They set up a study, too complicated to explain here, by which they intended to prove that the influence of the stars was all hokum. But, to their horror, the study proved them wrong. They found that the basic tenets of astrology really seemed to work. There was no room for truth in the skeptical organization, so they canceled the press conference they had planned and tried to sweep their findings under their humanist carpets. Some of the members who had worked on the study quit the club in a rage. The whole skeptical cause seemed endangered for a while, but they managed to recover, perhaps by tying in with the Man Was Never Meant to Fly club that meets annually at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. As you might surmise, outstanding members of the Skeptics Sewing Circle included Mr. Class and Mr. Randy. At their 1987 convention, Dr. Carl Sagan and Dr. Isaac Asimov were among the featured speakers. Passport to Oblivion. Dealing with learned critics is hardship enough, but we also have to worry about mysterious, well-financed hoaxers who go to incredible lengths to stir things up. One of the most outstanding examples took place in 1966 when a handsome young man in expensive clothes suddenly appeared in New York City, accompanied by two stunning young ladies. They checked into a luxury hotel, and then Mel Noel, that's the name he used, systematically visited all the leading magazines and newspapers. He was signing reporters up for a trip into outer space. According to Mr. Noel, a flying saucer was scheduled to land on the set of the Jackie Gleason television show in Florida. Anyone who wanted to go aboard had to apply for a space passport. It was free, but Noel needed a couple of passport pictures from each eager participant. He took top editors, newspapermen, and authors to fancy lunches in the best restaurants. He was articulate, well-mannered, and appeared to be sincere. We all wondered what the scam was, but we all gave him the required photos. Insiders knew that comedian Jackie Gleason was obsessed with the flying saucer myth. He even built a saucer-shaped hideaway in the Catskills, and he often boasted about his huge collection of books on psychic phenomena and UFOs. He was a hardcore true believer, and it is possible that he was financing Noel's travels about the U.S. The girls may have been from his famous chorus of Glee girls. I fully expected to receive some kind of space passport in the mail, but Mr. Noel and his companions faded away, and it never came. No flying saucer ever landed on the Gleason set. Around the same time, a mysterious Mr. Alexander swept into Manhattan, rented office space, and hired a secretary. Then he contacted various Forteans and ufologists, indicating that he was about to start a magazine, but after a few weeks he too vanished. Later, he appeared in other cities, tracked down local UFO books and UFO buffs, and repeated the charade. He even predicted the appearances of UFOs in Los Angeles, and sure enough, they showed up right on schedule. Maybe he rode off in one of them because he hasn't been seen since. Another kind of seemingly well-financed hoax is the mailing of sophisticated documents to second-string researchers at regular intervals. Usually, these purport to be secret government documents about crash saucers and little green men pickled in bottles. Some deal with the men in black, who are an integral part of witchcraft lore. For the hoax to succeed, several psychological conditions must be present. It helps if the recipient is a latent paranoid and total suspension of disbelief coupled with a hungry ego and capable of sound logic are certainly necessary. Such conditions are more than abundant in the hardcore UFO field. European ufologists have been enmeshed in the most expensive hoax of all for 20 years. Citizens of the planet UMMO have been sending long, complicated letters about cosmic matters in several different languages with postmarks from Australia, Tibet, Africa, South America, etc. These letters almost make sense. They deal with science and philosophy, and someone has obviously spent a great deal of time in preparing them. In the 1970s, the UMMO fraud gripped the entire country of France. Everyone from the prime minister, his cabinet members, and leading French scientists became involved. The UMMO letters poured in, and the government of France was convinced that the long awaited contact with extraterrestrials was about to take place. French civilian ufologists were ecstatic. Gradually, they all began to realize they had been duped. How and by whom was never clear. The French intelligence service could never pinpoint the actual source of the letters. Eventually, the French government decided to turn the whole matter over to the civilians, and by the late 1970s, even the hardcore ufologists were discouraged. They decided that UFOs were not extraterrestrial visitants, but a socio-psychological phenomenon. France became the first nation in the world to have its civilian ufologists take a negative stance. They all became Hochsteters. Though we learned much about the UFO phenomenon in the last 20 years, newcomers to the field have to wade through old literature, most of it insane or incoherent, to grasp fully the meaning of the UFO phenomenon. We need to have knowledge of history and be able to view all of man's beliefs objectively. There are no visitors from UMMO in our midst. I guarantee it. But something is happening to this planet. Something off the wall and unexpected. And that ends that chapter. It turns out at some point my chat had broken. Hey, Arkham. Hey, Eric. Hey, Vito. Should also, yep, I was about to say that should also be an hour. So if we have any questions or commentary, if we would like to say anything, now is the time.